June 4th, 1942, the carriers below moved in routine motion, refueling, rearming, preparing the next attack. The sky above them appeared empty. No threat, no movement, just light and silence. But at a height where engines strained and breath thinned, American dive bomber crews hovered, waiting for one moment. When the dive began, it was not an attack. It was a verdict. Continue with us by subscribing. This is the moment the Pacific War turned. In the first months of 1942, the Pacific Ocean became a vast arena of uncertainty and shifting momentum. Japan had advanced with astonishing speed after the attack on Pearl Harbor. One outpost after another fell to the Imperial Navy. The Pacific Fleet suffered heavy losses, and much of the world believed Japan would dominate the ocean for years to come. Their carrier strike groups were experienced, coordinated, and confident. For a moment, the Empire of Japan held the initiative. Yet, beneath the surface of these early victories, another story was forming. Quiet, analytical, and patient. The United States Navy, though shaken, was not broken. Its aircraft carriers, spared at Pearl Harbor, remained operational. They became the backbone of a new kind of war. One fought not by battleships and broadsides, but by air wings launched from moving runways of steel. At the center of this transformation was a small group of cryptanalysts working from a windowless basement room in Pearl Harbor known as Station Hypo. Their task was not heroic in the traditional sense. They fought not with weapons, but with intercepted radio signals, fragments of codes, and patterns that others overlooked. Under Commander Joseph Rochefort, they uncovered something critical. The Japanese Navy was preparing a major offensive to eliminate the American carriers once and for all. The target was listed only as AF in Japanese communications. Hypo analysts suspected AF was Midway Atoll, a small U.S. outpost positioned strategically between Hawaii and Japan. To prove it, they used a measured deception. Midway's garrison transmitted an unencrypted message reporting a water shortage. Shortly afterward, Japanese communications reported that AF is short of water. The suspicion became certainty. This intelligence advantage changed everything. The United States knew where the Japanese fleet would be and approximately when it would arrive. Rather than being caught off guard, the U.S. Navy would meet the attack head-on. 3 American carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, moved quietly into position northeast of Midway. The Japanese believed Yorktown had been sunk weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Instead, it had been repaired at Pearl Harbor in just 72 hours, an engineering feat driven not by optimism, but necessity. Every available welder, mechanic, and shipwright worked without pause to make the carrier seaworthy again. It sailed with scars still visible on its decks and bulkheads. By early June, both fleets moved through the Pacific with deliberate purpose. For the Japanese, the objective was decisive: crush American carrier strength and secure uncontested control. For the United States, the objective was simpler and more urgent: survival as a Pacific power. But victory would not come from numbers alone. Japan still had more experienced carrier aviators. Their Zero fighters were agile and deadly. Their naval commanders were seasoned from years of conflict in China and Southeast Asia. What the Americans possessed, however, was something different: an increasing mastery of altitude, timing, and the psychology of attack. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber was not the fastest aircraft in the Pacific. It was not the most elegant, yet it possessed characteristics that mattered at one specific moment: the moment of the vertical dive. It was stable at altitude, responsive under stress, and able to withstand steep, controlled descents that would tear apart lighter-framed aircraft. American aviators trained not merely to fly, but to fall with precision. Where most air forces taught pilots to think horizontally, distance, closure speed, angle of approach, the The U.S. Navy trained its dive bomber squadrons to think vertically. Height was not just position, it was stored energy. It was potential attack. It was the difference between being seen and being invisible. And so, in the days leading to the battle, three elements converged. Intelligence that revealed where the enemy would be. Carriers positioned in silence, ready to launch. Aircrews disciplined to hold impossible altitude until the exact moment of descent. Japan expected a straightforward confrontation. What awaited instead was an attack that would appear not from the horizon, but from a place where aircraft were never expected to linger. The cold, thin ceiling of the sky. The stage for Midway was set, not by chance, but by preparation. The advantage that mattered most was already in motion, moving quietly and steadily toward the moment of impact. The next step is to understand the machines and the men who would meet at that altitude. The Battle of Midway was not only shaped by strategy and intelligence, it was determined by the capabilities and limitations of the aircraft themselves. In the Pacific sky, design philosophy was as decisive as courage. Every aircraft carried the intention of the engineers who built it and the doctrine of the nation that deployed it. The difference between survival and loss often came down to what a machine could endure when pushed to the edge. On the Japanese side stood the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter that had already earned a formidable reputation across the Pacific. It was fast, agile, and exceptionally maneuverable. Built with weight reduction as a core principle, the Zero possessed unmatched turning ability in close combat. Yet the very features that made it swift and precise also defined its limitations. To achieve its maneuverability, the Zero sacrificed armor protection and structural reinforcement. It was a thoroughbred, but a fragile one. The Zero excelled at low and mid-altitude engagements, where quick reaction and aggressive maneuvering determined outcomes. Japanese pilots were trained to attack swiftly, dominate, and disengage before the enemy could respond. Their doctrine assumed that battles would unfold in horizontal planes, where agility mattered more than endurance. The United States Navy approached air combat differently. Their thinking did not center on turning battles, but on controlled sequences of energy advantage. The aircraft that embodied this approach was the Douglas SBD Dauntless. To an observer, it appeared unremarkable. Neither sleek nor fast, with a frame that looked heavier than its rivals. Yet its true strength emerged when altitude and gravity entered the equation. The Dauntless was built around airframe durability. The structure could tolerate high aerodynamic stress. The wings were reinforced to prevent structural failure during near-vertical descents. The air brakes, mounted along the trailing edges, allowed pilots to control their fall, not simply surrender to it. This combination gave the Dauntless a tactical dimension that few aircraft in the world could match. At high altitudes, where the air thinned and engines strained, the Zero lost responsiveness and stability. The Dauntless did not. It could hold altitude, wait, glide, and remain poised until the moment the pilot committed to the dive. The Japanese fighter pilots understood this, but only in technical terms. Many had never witnessed the full tactical execution of this capability in a real battle. That would change at Midway. The Dauntless also had a specific advantage that was not easily visible in specifications: pilot training doctrine. American aviators were taught not merely to fly the aircraft, but to fight in coordinated roles, in pairs, in formations, and in synchronized attack sequences. Each section of 3 aircraft could support the others. Even as casualties mounted, structural discipline held. The Japanese approach emphasized individual skill and aggressive initiative. Many early war carrier pilots were highly experienced, but their system relied on the assumption that these veterans would remain in combat long-term. By Midway, the attrition of skilled aviators had already begun to erode the qualitative advantage Japan once enjoyed. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy was training new aviators with consistent methodology, linking every stage of training to operational task execution. Dive bomber crews drilled relentlessly on maintaining altitude, controlling their descent, and striking with accuracy under extreme pressure. They learned to wait at the upper reaches of the sky, where aircraft vibrated from cold and engines struggled, to preserve the element of vertical surprise. The contrast was clear. Japan expected dogfights. America planned controlled descents from above enemy awareness. This difference in expectations shaped the coming battle. Japanese pilots scanned the horizon and the clouds, expecting attackers to approach along visible paths. They did not think to look almost directly above them. The human eye is trained to detect motion across, not motion falling vertically from a point of stillness. Technology and doctrine aligned into a singular advantage: the ability to strike unseen until the final seconds of approach. By June 4, 1942, two air forces carried not only different machines, but different beliefs about how the sky should be used. One believed in speed and agility at mid-level combat. The other believed in altitude, patience, and the power of controlled gravity. The results of these beliefs would soon be measured in the brief, violent minutes of the dive. Now that the machines are understood, the next step is the men who trained to use them and the methods they relied on to fall with precision. The U.S. Navy understood that altitude was only an advantage if a pilot could use it under pressure. To hold an aircraft steady where the air thins and the engine strains requires discipline, patience, and an exacting confidence in both machine and self. In training fields scattered across the United States, Florida, California, and islands stretching east across the Pacific, dive bomber crews spent long hours learning the one maneuver that defined their role: the controlled vertical descent. A dive bombing attack did not begin with the dive. It began much earlier in the climb. Crews practiced ascending to altitudes where oxygen ran thin, and the world below softened into muted color. There, they learned to maintain formation, to correct drift instinctively, and to trust the instruments when the horizon seemed to vanish into haze. At such heights, every motion mattered. A small error became a widening path. A moment of hesitation became separation. Precision at altitude was not natural. It was trained. The SBD Dauntless required deliberate hands. Pilots memorized the aircraft's stall characteristics, the engine response curve, and the subtle vibrations that signaled the airframe's limits. They trained to feel the aircraft as much as fly it. Instructors emphasized timing and measured breathing. Young aviators repeated the same ascent and descent drills until the actions no longer required conscious thought. When the dive began, the world narrowed to a single line. The pilot rolled the aircraft into position, pointed the nose down, and let gravity take hold. The Dauntless did not simply fall. It entered a planned descent angle, typically between 60 and 80 degrees. Too shallow and accuracy suffered. Too steep and structural forces multiplied, risking loss of control. Pilots learned to adjust dive flaps to stabilize the descent and prevent speed from exceeding structural tolerances. In this posture, the sky became a tunnel, and the target below grew steadily larger, slow at first, then rapidly. Then suddenly, accuracy in dive bombing came from stability, not improvisation. Pilots aimed using a fixed sight, timing their bomb release to the second. Slight deviations in angle led to near misses. Training ingrained the exact rhythm. Roll dive brakes engaged. Nose steady sight. Aligned release at the pre-calculated altitude. Pull-up under compressive stress. The pull-out was the most dangerous moment. The aircraft, traveling near maximum speed, exerted tremendous force on the wings and fuselage as the pilot pulled the nose back upward. Aviators trained their bodies to withstand the surge of gravity. Lungs compressed, vision dimming at the edges. The Dauntless was designed to survive this moment. The pilot's endurance determined whether the aircraft could climb again. At sea, training became more demanding. Pilots learned to identify targets not on a chalkboard, but against the shifting patterns of sunlight on the ocean. They studied the way shadows moved across carrier decks, how smokestacks masked silhouettes, and how anti-aircraft bursts distorted distance and timing. Instructors taught not theory, but recognition, the ability to locate vulnerability amid motion, surface glare, and chaos. Radio discipline was strict. Many attacks were carried out in silence. Formation leaders signaled descent with a tilt of the wing or a subtle break in pattern. Each pilot relied on the others to maintain spacing, timing, and lane of attack. Dive bomber crews were not solo performers. They were synchronized instruments of a single strike. Meanwhile, intelligence briefings refined the aviators' understanding of their enemy. Pilots studied the capabilities and weaknesses of Japanese carriers. They learned how flight deck crews moved, how aircraft were fueled and armed, and how strike waves were prepared. They knew that if they attacked at the right moment, when enemy decks were crowded with fueled aircraft and loaded weapons, the damage would multiply exponentially. Thus, training extended beyond flight technique. It included timing, observation, and patience. The greatest strike was not always the earliest. It was the one delivered when the enemy was most vulnerable. By the time the American dive bomber squadrons reached Midway, they were not only skilled, they were conditioned to wait at the unreachable heights of the sky. They had learned to hold silence, to measure their breathing through oxygen masks, and to trust the fall. The Japanese pilots would see them only in the final seconds, when gravity had already decided the outcome. Now the Japanese perspective must be understood. What they expected, what they believed, and what they never thought possible. To understand the shock that unfolded at Midway, it is necessary to step into the mindset of the Japanese carrier aviators on the morning of June 4, 1942. They entered the battle with confidence, shaped by months of rapid victories across the Pacific. Their pilots were regarded as some of the finest naval aviators in the world, veterans of campaigns stretching back to the late 1930s. They had flown over China, Malaya, Java, and the Coral Sea. They were skilled, aggressive, and accustomed to dictating the terms of the air war. Their confidence was not arrogance without root. It emerged from repeated success. Japanese doctrine taught that speed, initiative, and maneuver determined control of the sky. The A6M-0 reinforced this belief. It was an aircraft built for dogfighting dominance, light, responsive, and deadly in trained hands. Pilots believed that once the battle began, they would overwhelm their adversaries as they had done many times before. But this confidence relied on a crucial assumption, that enemy aircraft would engage on horizontal planes, within typical combat altitudes and patterns. Japanese aviators expected threats from the direction of the sun, from cloud breaks, or from the horizon. Their eyes were trained on lateral threat vectors. They did not look to the upper reaches of the sky, where the air thinned and few aircraft could remain stable. On the morning of the attack, the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were operating in coordinated formation. Their flight decks were busy, launching and recovering strike groups. Maintenance crews refueled aircraft, rearmed torpedoes, rechecked engines, and prepared for coordinated follow-up strikes. Commanders believed that the decisive blows of the day would be delivered by their own dive bombers and torpedo planes. What they did not expect was that American dive bombers were already positioned high above them, beyond sight, waiting. There were signs, but they were subtle. A scout plane late in reporting. Radar returns misinterpreted. A delayed radio message requesting confirmation. None appeared to be the final warning. The Japanese carriers had just finished arming and preparing a second strike. Aircraft clustered on deck. Ordnance lay stacked beside fueling hoses. The decks were exposed, vulnerable in a way only visible to those who understood how close timing could determine fate. Japanese pilots returning from the early wave did not see American air power waiting at altitude. They saw only the sea and clouds. Their perspective was built by experience, And that experience told them threats would appear as they always had, from visible approach paths and manageable distances, but altitude was invisible. The first indication that something was wrong was not sound. It was shadow, a brief flicker across the carrier deck, a pattern of movement too fast to register yet unmistakable in its meaning. Then came the realization. Something was falling from directly above, and falling with purpose. To the Japanese aviators and deck crews, the speed of the descent was shocking. Aircraft did not approach that way. Even experienced pilots could not comprehend how the American dive bombers had positioned themselves at such impossible height without being detected. The Zero could climb toward them, yes, but climbing took time, fuel, and altitude the fighter did not hold in reserve at that moment. And while the Zero excelled in ascent rate, it had limits beyond which maneuver became unstable. At those heights, even the slightest misjudgment could lead to a stall. The Americans had chosen their battleground not by chance, but by design. The Japanese pilots realized this too late. They watched as the Dauntlesses tipped forward and entered the vertical dive, steady, controlled, silent in their determination. The sky that had seemed so empty only moments earlier was now full of motion, geometry, and falling steel. For the Japanese, the moment was not only tactical shock, it was psychological displacement. They were not meeting the enemy where they expected him. They were being struck from a domain they had believed impractical, unreachable, unnecessary to monitor. The Japanese carriers were exposed at the worst possible moment, and the American dive bombers were descending with accuracy shaped by training, endurance, and altitude discipline. The battle's turning point was seconds away. Now the dive begins. The fall moves from potential to impact. The carriers below wait in the tight space between surprise and destruction. The moment came just before 10:22 a.m. The Pacific looked calm, almost indifferent, as if the ocean understood that battles could come and go while its surface remained unchanged. Above that still water, in air so thin it shimmered, U.S. Navy dive bomber squadrons from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown held formation. Engines strained, hands tightened on throttles, voices stayed silent. Every pilot focused not on the sea, but on the black specks of Japanese carriers far below. They had climbed to an altitude few aircraft attempted to maintain in combat. At this height, metal vibrated. Oxygen masks rasped. The world narrowed to instrument needles and the faint tremor of the aircraft frame resisting cold air. It was a place where the Zero lost its agility and where human endurance replaced speed as the currency of survival. The American pilots waited. They waited because altitude alone was not the weapon. Timing was. Below them, the Japanese strike groups were returning. Carriers shifted course to receive them. Deck crews guided planes with flags and hand signals. In that window, fleeting but real, the carriers had to remain predictable. Straight-line movement, steady speed, no evasive turns. They were exposed in one of the most dangerous conditions a carrier can ever enter: recovery cycle. On the Akagi, the flagship of the Japanese carrier group, flight deck crews were refueling and rearming aircraft for the next attack on Midway. Bombs lay on rolling carts. Fuel hoses stretched across planked surfaces. Officers monitored flight patterns, unaware that American aircraft were already aligning for the descent. The American squadron leaders saw what they needed: targets vulnerable and unaware. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber group, scanned the carriers below and made his decision. There was no dramatic speech, no transmitted rallying cry, only a small, controlled roll of his wings, the silent signal to dive. Then gravity took command. The Dauntlesses tipped over and began their descent. The sky did not break into noise. It simply accelerated downward. The initial seconds were nearly silent. The aircraft falling faster than sound could catch up. The pilots felt their stomachs press upward, their bodies drawn forward, their controls vibrating in their grip. As they dropped, the ocean surface rose rapidly. The Japanese carriers, once distant outlines, now grew sharp and defined. The red circles painted on their flight decks became larger, then enormous. Perfect visual guides for the sighting lines of bombs. Anti-aircraft crews reacted late. By the time they raised their guns and sighted upward, the Dauntlesses were already committed to the dive, locked into angles that minimized their exposure and maximized their accuracy. On the flight decks, Japanese officers and sailors looked up and saw not the slow arc of an approaching aircraft, but the vertical fall of controlled steel, something that defied their expectations of how air combat unfolded. Then the bomb bay doors opened. Each Dauntless released a single 500-pound bomb, timed not by guesswork, but by altitude markers read in fractions of seconds. The bombs did not fall randomly. They followed precise calculations made in training, tested over months of drills, reinforced by memory and muscle. The first bomb struck Kaga. It penetrated the flight deck and detonated deep inside, where fuel lines and munitions waited. Fire erupted instantly, followed by a second explosion, and then a third, each fueled by the very weapons the carrier had prepared to send against the Americans. Flames rose into columns of black smoke that twisted upward like signals of irreversible consequence. Another wave of Dauntlesses fell upon Akagi. A single bomb landed near the midsection of the flight deck, igniting fuel stores and spreading fire across the hangar level. Within minutes, Akagi's ability to launch or recover aircraft was gone. The ship was still afloat, but tactically finished. Meanwhile, Soryu was struck repeatedly. The carrier's interior detonated with enough force to tear open its upper decks. The ship slowed, smoke trailing behind it like a dark scar against the sky. The Japanese air fleet, the pride of its navy, was being dismantled in the span of 5 minutes, not by overwhelming numbers, not by faster aircraft, but by altitude, patience, training, and the decision to fall at the right moment. Yet the battle was not finished. One Japanese carrier remained operational. Hiryu, and Hiryu would respond. The second half of the climax unfolds with counterstrikes, endurance, and final decisive blows. Smoke trailed across the Pacific horizon like rising curtains, and for a brief moment, the sea seemed to hold its breath. 3 Japanese carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, were burning. Flames tore through their wooden decks. Explosions rippled through hangar levels, and black columns rose into the sky, marking not only physical destruction, but a shift in the balance of the Pacific War. Yet the battle was not decided. One carrier remained, Hiryu. Hiryu's flight deck crews had not been preparing for recovery. They were armed, fueled, and ready. The ship's captain and air officers understood the situation immediately. They launched their aircraft in 2 waves, each guided by the urgency of a fleet fighting for survival. These were not attacks made in confidence. They were attacks made in defiance. Japanese pilots, trained in precision and speed, aimed now for retaliation that might claw back the initiative. Their target was USS Yorktown. Yorktown had already been heavily damaged at Coral Sea and restored in record time. Scars still visible across her deck plates, but she was operational, and in total wartime logic, operational meant essential. The first Japanese wave located Yorktown and descended. American fighter screens intercepted, but not completely. Bombs struck the carrier, puncturing through the deck and igniting below. Smoke rose. The ship slowed. Yet the crew moved with practiced discipline. Damage control teams sealed compartments, redirected steam lines, isolated ruptured fuel feeds, and suppressed fires as the ship continued to maneuver. The carrier that was supposed to be gone before Midway still endured. Hiryu launched a second attack wave. This one carried torpedoes. And torpedoes are different from bombs. They strike below, where the hull is most vulnerable. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's starboard side. The ship listed sharply. Pumps whirred. Counter-flooding began. But the structural damage was severe. This time, Yorktown could not continue flight operations. Orders passed across the deck, not in panic, but in calm command. Crew evacuated to surrounding destroyers. The ship drifted slowly, wounded but upright. Yorktown was silent now. But the Americans were not. Enterprise and Hornet still had operational air wings, and the search began, not for fleets, not for formations, but for one carrier burning fuel at unsustainable pace, the last strength of the Japanese strike force. Locating Hiryu required coordination across air and sea. Scouts flew outward in widening arcs. The Pacific stretched endless in every direction. And yet, they found her. The last Japanese carrier sailed with determination, its flag still raised, smoke trailing behind in thin threads. U.S. dive bombers launched again. This time there was no element of total surprise. Hiryu's anti-aircraft batteries fired immediately. Black bursts of shrapnel marking the sky in tight patterns. Fighters rose to intercept. The air filled with traces of metal, smoke, and the hard geometry of converging flight paths. But even in defense, Hiryu faced the same limitation as her sister ships. She could not escape downward strikes. Once more, the Dauntlesses climbed to the heights where Japanese pilots could not effectively pursue. Once more, they waited, not rushing, not forcing the attack. Once more, the altitude became silence, and silence became control. Then they dived. Hiryu's crew braced as bombs fell, not in scattered drops, but in intentional lines. The first penetrated near the forward flight deck, sending fire sweeping across the deck planks. The second struck aft, rupturing fuel storage. A third ignited aircraft still being readied below deck levels. The flames were fast, consuming, final. Hiryu did not explode in a single catastrophic blast. She burned steadily, fiercely, refusing to sink quickly, as if the ship itself understood the weight of the moment. By day's end, all 4 Japanese carriers of the strike force were lost. The carrier group that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor was now scattered and consumed by fire on open seas. Japan had not only lost ships, it had lost trained air crews, deck crews, and the coordinated strike capability that had defined its early dominance. In 5 minutes of diving, the course of the Pacific War had been altered. Not through luck, not through chance, but through altitude discipline, endurance, timing, and the quiet moment where men held steady above the limits of the sky. The battle was won, but the consequences were only beginning. The fires that consumed the Japanese carriers burned long into the night, smoldering against the quiet vastness of the Pacific. The smoke rose into a dark column visible for miles, a monument not only to the destruction of steel and deck planking, but to the collapse of momentum that had carried Japan through the early months of the war. The Battle of Midway did not merely destroy ships, it altered the balance of naval power. In total, 4 fleet carriers were lost: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were not simply vessels. They were the core of Japan's striking arm. Each carrier represented not only its physical presence, but decades of accumulated experience. Their loss meant the loss of trained air wings, flight coordinators, aviation maintenance crews, and irreplaceable pilots. Japan had entered Midway with an elite aviator corps forged through years of conflict. Those aviators could not be replaced quickly, if at all. Meanwhile, the United States had structured its aviation training pipeline to grow, expand, and improve in predictable cycles. For every pilot lost at Midway, new groups were already in training, preparing to join the fleet. American strategy did not rely on the longevity of a few elite aces. It relied on the steady development of capable pilots, supported by a logistical network designed to sustain prolonged conflict. Japan's early war strength, derived from concentrated excellence, now became a weakness in a war of attrition. The loss of the carriers also forced Japan into a defensive posture for the first time. Prior to Midway, Japanese naval operations sought initiative and expansion. The Imperial Navy chose where to strike, when to engage, and how long to remain in contested waters. After Midway, Japan no longer possessed the operational flexibility to dictate the terms of battle. The strategic initiative shifted across the Pacific to American hands. The United States now held the capability to launch offensives that the Japanese Navy could not easily counter. This shift became visible within weeks, as U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942. What followed was a long, grueling struggle fought in dense jungles, storm-thick waters, and skies contested at every altitude. But unlike before Midway, Japan now fought under the weight of replacement delays and diminished aviation coordination. The edge of momentum had passed to the United States. On the American side, the victory brought affirmation. The gamble at Midway, to position the carriers north of the atoll based on intelligence rather than direct reconnaissance, had proven correct. The decision to train dive bomber pilots to hold altitude until the exact moment of descent had proven decisive. The SBD Dauntless, often overlooked in pre-war assessments, had demonstrated its value not only as a bombing platform, but as a weapon of precision and endurance. Reports compiled after the battle examined the factors that shaped the outcome. Commanders emphasized the strategic value of code-breaking and intelligence analysis, the tactical advantage of altitude-controlled dive bombing, the importance of disciplined air group coordination. Aircraft manufacturers took note. The lessons of Midway informed new design priorities: stronger airframes, improved oxygen systems, reliable dive brakes, and engine performance at high altitudes. The dive bomber would eventually be replaced by faster, more versatile strike aircraft, but its role at Midway remained singular and irreplaceable. For Japan, the shock of the defeat ran deep. Naval strategists reviewed the battle and identified not one catastrophic error, but a chain of assumptions. They had believed American carriers were weaker, slower to mobilize, and less coordinated. They had believed altitude beyond operational engagement was unnecessary. They had believed their pilots could recover momentum even if surprised. None of these beliefs survived Midway. In the months that followed, Japanese aircraft carriers still sailed, but they did so without the same unity, without the same experienced aviators, and without the same strategic confidence. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years, but the direction of the war had changed in the 5 minutes of the dive. Victory did not come from overwhelming strength. It came from preparation, endurance, and control of the sky. The reflection of this moment stretches beyond naval warfare, beyond military strategy, to something closer to the nature of resolve. In the quiet that followed Midway, long after the flames dimmed and the wreckage slipped beneath the Pacific, the story of the battle settled into history not as an accident of timing, but as the result of choices carried out with discipline. The victory did not belong to chance or luck. It belonged to men who trained to endure the thin air where engines stuttered and where nerves had to hold steady. It belonged to aviators who understood that the sky was not only a place to fly, but a place to wait. The Japanese pilots who survived the battle spoke of the shock they felt, that the attack had come from above, from a height they had believed unusable, impractical, unnecessary. Yet war often reveals the value of what seems excessive in peace. The Americans had trained for a moment that could not be predicted, only prepared for. When it arrived, they recognized it instantly. There is a certain clarity in the vertical dive. Gravity becomes an ally. Discipline becomes the only defense against fear. The world narrows to a line, a sight, a calculation measured in seconds. Mistakes are final. Confidence must be earned before the descent begins, not during it. That was the American strength at Midway. Preparation matched to circumstance. The dive bomber crews did not change history through numbers, nor through superior machinery, nor through physical advantage. They changed it through control of the moment. A moment shaped by patient climb, silent positioning, and the willingness to fall when the time was right. It is easy to measure war in terms of victories and losses, in ships sunk and territory gained. But the deeper measure lies in decisions made in quiet places, before the battle begins. The endurance to hold position in cold air. The trust built between pilot and aircraft. The patience to wait for the one opening that matters. Midway reminds us that skill is not always seen in speed or strength or visibility. Sometimes it is seen in stillness, in altitude, in the long-held breath before action. The men who dove that day carried with them not only bombs, but the weight of possibility. When they released their weapons, they also released the momentum of a war that would no longer move in the same direction. And history followed the fall.